Okay, so based on those themes, we feel that we can draw basically three conclusions from the research. And the first conclusion is that clearly through these interviews, we're seeing teachers at relatively low levels of identity development along Helm's scale. That is, almost all the teachers are at the abandonment phase. That is, they're still working to recognize and release prejudices, stereotypes, and they haven't had a chance actually really to move to an area where they understand the nature of systemic privilege and how that plays out in society. This is all indicated by our themes, including their desire to be colorblind. That is, their philosophy is, I shouldn't see differences in skin color or differences in income. I should treat all students the same. And yet we know to cross these cultural boundaries, to address student needs, we need to understand and see racial, ethnic, social class, gender differences. And yet they're trying to pull away from that. So that's a good indication of being at the first phase. The other indication is their lack of recognition of systemic issues in their own instruction. They didn't really want to talk about their own instruction. They weren't discussing these problems in terms of the nature of their own instruction. They were focused on issues with parents and issues with students. So it's another good piece of evidence of them being at a relatively low level of identity development. So it raises the question, in spite of the high levels of professional development they've gotten in this area, why are they still at relatively low levels of identity development? And our evidence seems to indicate because they're suffering from what Senge calls learning disabilities. And there are several that we see playing out in our data. The first two are, I am my position and the enemy is out there. This is the idea of, I don't need to focus on anything other than what I do in my classroom is my only responsibility, and it's other people's issues to deal with broader things. The enemy is out there is the problem isn't with me in my responsibilities. What I've been doing for years and years and years works. There's something, there's a problem out here that has to be addressed in some different way. And we can see that in the data because, again, they didn't focus on their instruction. They focused on students, focused on parents. So the other issue is the illusion of taking charge, where they did see a problem and did need to not modify their instruction, but modify their classroom management techniques. They focused on wanting to have more discipline for these students who weren't adapting appropriately to their instruction. And they felt like they were addressing the problem, that's what they needed to do to address the problem. And that's related to another Senge learning disability, which is learning from experience. Their experience told them, if I do more discipline, the problems will go away to a certain extent. Though the combination of those two learning disabilities are not allowing them to really step back and face the systemic issues of white and social class privileges that are embedded in the system and reflected in their own instruction. So they're not getting to that second level because of their sort of illusion of taking charge and learning from experience. The last one is the fixation on events. They're not seeing pieces interconnected. They're looking at specific learning behaviors in the classroom and solving those behaviors, and you've got to begin to see the interconnected relationship of everything in order to move to these higher levels of identity development. So that raises the question, why are they suffering from these learning disabilities? And our data indicates that they're actually at a low level of ego development. Probably the most powerful single finding theme that kept emerging was their sense of a lack of trust and respect. And that is an indication of focusing on their ego as a professional. So that focus on ego led us to realize that ego is at the center of this identity development process, and they're not moving up to higher levels of identity because of ego issues. So we see evidence that they're using ego defense mechanisms to protect the sense of who they are. And thus, if their ego doesn't develop, they're not going to develop along these other dimensions of identity development. And we saw examples of ego defense mechanisms, including denial, projection, rationalization, and transference of blame was evident in the data that we collected. And so on the surface of it, these teachers are very empathetic. It's not that they don't care about these students. They want the best for these students. They're trying to do the best they can. What they lack is not empathy, it's cultural empathy. And that is a key part of this entire process. It's developing an empathy that crosses boundaries. So given those conclusions, we have a set of recommendations for professional development for teachers. And we really want to focus on 3 areas. First, professional development needs to focus on all 4 of the frames of identity. Often, professional development really only engages the personal and not the enacted, relational, and communal. That's captured in a sort of a famous adage, which is when in a learning environment, I hear, I forget, I see, I remember, I do, I remember, I understand. That means that to really understand, to really keep and sustain knowledge, we need to do, and that's part of what's called the enacted frame, and we need to do a better job of bringing in enactment into it. And so there are many frameworks that say professional development should be preparation, experience, and reflection. That experience captures that enactment, but reflection is key. So our recommendation is we feel that professional development, in order to help teachers move through this identity development process, can use simulations. Simulations there are 2 kinds, what's called vicarious simulations and enacted simulations. Vicarious simulations, when teachers watch a videotape or watch a situation and reflect on how they see this being culturally responsive. Enacted is when, of course, they're put in a situation and must enact it. We're not doing enough of that. To do good, and simulations allow us to do both of those. To do good reflection, we need to focus on both reflection and action. That is, asking teachers as they're going through a simulation, why are you doing what you're doing? Reflect on it. How does this fit in? But also do extensive reflection on action, which means afterwards reflect in depth on what happened and why and what they think of it. The importance of this kind of deeper types of reflection is it gets to double loop learning. Double loop learning refers to unearthing invisible, unexamined underlying assumptions, such as deficit perspectives, and the learning disabilities and the ego defense mechanisms. It's unearthing those things, challenging them, and changing them. So we think that ultimately professional development needs to have students, teachers, focus on ego defense mechanisms and the barriers to systems thinking. So that's certainly, and simulations allow that, but we also feel that peer coaching would be a powerful method that is bringing teachers together to give each other feedback as they go through trying things out in the classroom and talking about it. So those are our recommendations. In fact, we know in terms of professional development, teachers don't learn a lot from workshops outside the classroom. They learn the most in the classroom. Anyway, that's our presentation. I'd like to thank everybody for providing us the opportunity. And if you have questions, there is contact information through the organizers of the conference, and we would love to entertain any questions, concerns, or comments that you might have.
Thank you all very much for your time.